Мы с большим удовольствием сегодня представляем нашего гостя Любошу Блага. Это известный словацкий политолог, исследователь Института политических наук Словацкой Академии наук. Господин Блага является председателем комитета Национального совета Словацкой Республики по европейским делам. В 2018 году господин Блага возглавлял словацкую делегацию на сессии ПАСЕ. Сегодня он представляет вашему вниманию доклад как результат исследований о марксизма, развитии марксизма в современных национальных экономиках. И, название доклада звучит как «Марксизм, национальное государство и глобализация». В принципе, да, в текущих условиях развития, и общества, и в целом вообще мировой ситуации, крайней неустойчивости, волатильности, действительно большой интерес вызывает как раз трансформация, направление развития классических экономических учений. И вот господин Блага будет вам сегодня, рассказывать результаты своих исследований, доносить о, развитии марксизма. Приветствую.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Любоша Блага, as it was said, and I'm coming from Slovakia, but I'm going to tell you more about Western thought and not about Slovakian thought. There is not many which we offer in the history of political thought and economic thought. The truth is that my new book, Anti-globalism, which I'm going to present you, or some arguments from this book, is very much based on the authors and theorists from the Western world, but also from the Africa, Latin America, and Asia, because as it goes, the globalization theories are still much more influenced by the theorists from the third world or from the development world. The title of my lecture is The Marxism, Nationalism and Globalization, but as I understood, you are the students from the economic or political economy, so probably I will be more concentrated not on the history of political thought of Marxism, as I intended before, but I will try to explain the new waves of Marxism and the new ways of economic thinking in left-wing anti-globalist thinking. So I will speak more about the neo-Marxist theories, and then especially about one theory which is not Marxist at all, but it's still leftist, and it's the theory of Danny Rodrik. You probably know him as a great economist from the United States of Turkish origin. Well, I will speak about history of deglobalization, but I will start with this Marxism as I promised with my title. Well, I'm going to avoid these classical Marxist teachings of Marx, Lenin, and Gramsci, which I'm concentrated in my book, because as I said, you are economists, you will be totally bored with this. So I'm going to start with my main arguments in my books. Yes, they are very much inspired by Marxism and classical Marxism, but it's not necessary to go in deep. The main argument that I use in connections with the national question, and as you probably understood, the globalization and the national question is one big issue for many political philosophers and economists in the world, because if you want to have this global order or global governance, and if you want to have kind of liberal cosmopolitan world, then you cannot have also the national sovereignty and the national self-confidence, because it's the barrier to cosmopolitan order. And what's the purpose of Marxist thinking? In many ways, is kind of international order, where the national states will cooperate each other. But in some interpretations, Marxists wanted kind of cosmopolitan order. It means that there is no nations, no states. This is the final or decisive ideal of communism, or maybe you know it from the past, of Marxism, to have the world without any nations, to have the world which will be totally united on the base of world class based or working class based governance. The truth is that this is the ultimate goal of the communism or Marxism, but there is also a big road to this communism, and as you know from the history, it was defined by the state and by the nations. The nations and the states were not ignored and were not limited during the communist regimes, because this was the sense of the Marx and Lenin's theories. And that's why I also use my main argument in connections with the national questions, which was formulated by Marx, Lenin and Leon Trotsky, each of them in a similar context. Attacks to the nationalism of the small and weak nations are mostly the most suitable for the imperial powers that control these small peoples. When French Marxist Paul Lafargue spoke that the nations were only antiquated superstitions, Marx has reproached to him that he speaks like a French chauvinist, according to whom only the French nation had the right to exist. Marx argued similarly in the relations to Ireland, where he expected from the English workers the support of their Irish comrades who sought independence from the British Empire. It has to be shown that workers are not national chauvinists. Lenin had similarly reproached chauvinism to those Russian Marxists who boasted of internationalism, but in fact they only defended the imperial interests of Russia that oppressed the smaller and weaker nations. Lenin was consistent in this until his death and permanently attacked the great Russian chauvinism, hiding under the cover of internationalism. Trotsky explains the world problem in the relationships of empires and subjugated nations as follows, I quote, "The desire of ruling nation to maintain the status quo frequently dresses up as a superiority of nationalism, just as the desire of victorious nation to hang on to its booty easily takes the form of pacifism." The end of the quote. If you win the war and take another country what belongs to it, then pacifism is the most profitable way for you, because you do not want to lose your prey. If you are a power and control small and weak peoples, then the resistance to nationalism is the most advantageous approach for you, because you do not want to lose your power over others. It would be a tragedy for Marxism if it applies its normative visions to the reality in such an awkwardly way to serve the imperial interest of the powers. Several theorists of Marxism of the Second International understood it, including Lenin, and I freely follow them in my argument in my book. But now I will turn more to the modern Marxist thought, which is really very influential in the Western universities. Probably, I don't know how it is in your university, but in Slovakia, when you say Marx or Lenin, you are going to be imprisoned maybe, or you are like crazy guy. But when you say Marx or Lenin in London, Frankfurt or Paris, you are very popular because it's one of the most attractive philosophers of 20th century. So this is the difference, because probably the countries of post-communistic origin has still some kind of anxiety from Marxism and Leninist period. But if you want to make sometimes some penetration to the international theories of globalization and of political philosophy or political economy, you just cannot ignore Marx or Lenin, because you would be very, very in bad position in the Western universities. Everybody there speaks about Marx and Lenin. So I will try to expose you that there are many various theorists connected to Marxism who are talking also about the nation state and the globalization. Well, in the 70s, the question of the state dominated the Western Marxist theory. Especially Nikos Poulantzas and Ralph Miliband argued against each other. Poulantzas retained the structuralist model, claiming that the state apparatus must evoke the appearance of autonomy, but this ostentatious autonomy is only relative, because the demands of capitalism as an economic system always win. Miliband, on the other hand, advocated an instrumental model in which the idea of the relative autonomy of the state stood. Only in this way did Miliband explain that even the elections of the social democratic parties to the governments did not change the basic capitalist character of the liberal democratic state. According to him, capitalist, state bureaucrats and political leaders are linked in single cohesive group via their same social origins, similar lifestyles, values, and the existence of frequent networks and forums in which coordinated state policy strategies are being developed. In the vast majority of cases, therefore, there are people from social strata in the state apparatus who can be reliably expected to take pro-capitalistic views on social, economic, and industrial issues. Thus, the parliamentary methods are just senseless showcases intended to maintain the ideological illusion that there is an effective public control of state policy. I am also the member of parliament, and I can really confirm this idea. James O'Connor, who according to the functionalist basis came with the thesis of dualistic state, also greatly contributed to the discussion of the role of the state in the capitalist economy. There are three functions of the state in capitalism, and they are derived from the basic requirements of the production process, namely maintaining order, supporting the accumulation of capital, and creating the legitimacy of capitalism. If the capitalist state develops social programs, it does it so only to fulfill its three functions more effectively. The concept of a welfare state, therefore, does not lead to a weakening of capitalism, but rather to strengthening of it. In this context, O'Connor even refers to the social expenditures of the capitalist welfare state as a modern equivalent of repression, because they have devastating effect on the class consciousness of the working class. State social policy forms a space for maintaining social stability, which is a precondition for monopolistic capitalism. Thus, social legislation is not a product of social sentiments, but rather a pragmatic response to a possible social instability. In current Marxism, in general, three approaches of Marxists to the nation-state in the era of global capitalism can be recognized. First, it is the famous thesis of Marxist post-structuralism, like Antonio Negri and Tony Hart, according to which global capitalism has resulted in a formless empire that lacks holder of the power in the imperial states, but it itself creates a global totality of power, a structure of relations in which it is impossible to detect a center or periphery. It is impossible to return to the state in view of this radical globalized interpretation. The second view also argues that globalization devoured a state, which is manifested by the growing power of transnational corporations, markets, and financial capital. For example, William Robinson and Samir Amin are the representatives of this stream. But this stream considers some form of deglobalization as desirable and possible. I will defend this deglobalization view in my argumentation. The third view differs from the first two in the descriptive level because it considers the nation-state to be a key player in a global capitalism, in a globalization, and an indispensable tool for its maintenance. Ellen Maxine Wood, for example, in this context writes, I quote, "But while no one would deny the global reach of capital, there is little evidence that today's global capital is less in need of national states than were earlier capitalist interests. Global capital, no less than national capital, relies on nation-states to maintain local conditions favorable to accumulation as well as to help it navigate the global economy. It is useful to work with this view while developing a realistic perception of international politics." It can be said that none of the Marxist views can claim the absolute truth, and each of them is useful in some ways for the criticism of global capitalism. In certain, especially economic aspects, globalization weakens the regulatory and redistributive functions of the welfare state. But in geopolitical context, one can still feel that great power politics determines the character of international politics more than ideals of transnational ideologies. At the level of description, I'm trying to show that globalization has weakened the national state at social, economic, and ideological level. In the level of prescription, I argue that a certain degree of deglobalization and the return to the state regulatory functions at this stage of history have a greater chance to bring success to a socialist alternative than the utopian cosmopolitan visions of a global state that, in a view of the current weak position of the international labor movement, suits mainly transnational capital. It can be said that none of the Marxist views can claim the absolute truth, and each of them is useful in some ways in the criticism of global capitalism. Well, and one more methodological remark. As regards the realist contra structuralist paradigms, in the current Marxist theory, there are two fundamental views on the role of the state or powers, great powers, in globalization. The first is closer to the classic Lenin's definition of imperialism. According to this line of argumentation, the dominance of financial capital and transnational corporations is the main feature of global capitalism. But great powers, especially the USA, play the key role in the reproduction of the system. Thus, in globalization, not only purely economic logic, I mean hegemony of the transnational corporations, but also political power, realistic logic, it means hegemony of the US and the other Western powers operates. Imperial wars of the 21st century, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. Many geopolitical controversies of today, like Israel and Palestine, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Russia and Ukraine. Serious political decisions like Brexit, or not to mention the rise of the world leaders who put emphasis on national protectionism rather than transnational capital, like Donald Trump, are good examples of the fact that although the economic interest of capital is of paramount importance in great power logic, the great powers often follow geopolitical power logic and do not always obediently fulfill the interest of transnational capital. In this respect, the basic parameters of Lenin's analysis of capitalism continue to apply. This view is close to Alex Kalinikos, Immanuel Wallerstein, or David Harvey as a leading Marxist of today. According to the second view, imperialism is no longer about nations, and even the greatest power, United States, is merely fulfilling the interest of transnational capital. The states have virtually no autonomous role, and the whole operational logic of global capitalism has changed. The global capitalism transformed into a global empire where national borders do not fulfill their role and the dominion on transnational capital is virtually unlimited. Thus, the classic Lenin's definition of imperialism is overcome by this argument because the powers are far from having such an autonomous role as in the past, and basically they only express the interest of transnational, not national capital. For example, William Robinson, Michael Hart, and Tony Negri are of such opinion. Academic disputes about whether global capitalism is dominated by exclusively transnational corporations, capital, or imperial policy of states, including the United States, I do not consider crucial. The operational logic of global capitalism uses both actors, transnational corporations as well as states. My view is therefore closer to Kalinikos, Wallerstein, or Harvey, although I do not consider this question to be of the utmost importance. Well, for now I would like to change the subject and to present you some of the alternatives as I promised before, the alternatives which are connected to Marxism or the Marxist criticism of globalization, but still which are very realistic and very concrete in these current global times. And this, in my book I presented three such theories. One is from Danny Roderick, as I said before, the economist from Harvard. The second one is from Walden Bellow. He is the Filipinos activist and economist. And the third one is Samir Amin, who is the Marxist African philosopher and economist. I will concentrate on the first one. It's Danny Roderick, the Harvard-based Turkish origin American economist, because his theory is very influential and one of the most important among the anti or alter globalist theories. Well, Danny Roderick's suggestions came from a middle-class environment in which we can find a number of theories that call for a return to the Bretton Woods system. You probably, as economists, you know what does it mean, Bretton Woods system after the Second World War. In this context, Bellow speaks literally about the school of economic thinking under the title Back to the Bretton Woods School. The practical recommendations of these authors include, in particular, stronger control of capital flows at global or national level and the variations on Tobin tax theme, and hence the taxation of the financial transactions and speculations. These two options are very, very much discussed in the alter and anti-globalist literature. Capital controls and the Tobin tax. I would say that these are the two main instruments of deglobalization. Roderick describes his proposal as a regime, and now I quote, a regime of peaceful coexistence between national capitalisms, thus returning the perspective of international Keynesianism. And this is very important for you as well to know that Danny Roderick is one of the representatives of neo-Keynesianism. His idea is inspired by the Bretton Woods model, which was introduced after the World War II and lasted until 70s and 80s. Its architects were John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White. The Bretton Woods regime can be characterized as a weak multilateralism that has enabled political players to focus on domestic social needs and employment policies, while at the same time helping to recover and grow global trade. It was a compromise system that facilitated trade liberalization, but it also gave enough space to national governments to respond to domestic, social, and economic needs. Some of the most restrictive trade barriers were removed, but nation-states have retained the freedom to manage and create their own independent economic policies and build social systems according to their ideas. As far as developing countries are concerned, they have been allowed to develop their own specific pro-growth strategies, with interventions from outside were limited. The international flows of capital remained heavily limited. Roderick emphasizes that this was a system of moderate globalization, unlike today's hyper-globalization. He adds that if there ever was a golden era of globalization in history, it was during the Bretton Woods period, and thus in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The most well-known cases of the Bretton Woods regime are the welfare states in Western Europe, including the Bavarian liberal British social model, the Swedish social democratic Folkhemmet, it means people's home, or the German socio-market economy. Then French indicative planning or Japanese corporate Kigyoism, combined with the pro-export policy of the state headed by the Ministry of International Trade Industry, so-called MITI. In all these cases, a certain compromise between the so-called embedded liberalism and thus a system of incorporating economic systems into the social environment, international trade and production method, and the economic policies of states that have sought to protect their economies from the negative externalities and financial shocks were concerned. According to Sassen, this was the Bretton Woods formula for internationalism in its interest of political stability, economic growth, and social justice. Neoliberal critics can barely blame the Bretton Woods system for suppressing the economy, killing growth, or destroying productivity. The numbers prove the opposite. According to Roderick, the economic successes of the hyper-globalization years of 19th and 90s, thought in a broader historical perspective, are working well. But these successes are still smaller in comparison with the Bretton Woods period. In fact, the world economy does not work at the time of financial globalization as it did when the global trade was organized by the Bretton Woods rules. He notes that, I quote, "The growth champions of the last 3 decades, just as those of the immediate post-4 decades, were countries such as China that played the globalization game by Bretton Woods rules, rather than deep integration rules. They maintained capital controls, kept foreign finance at bay, and use their policy space for domestic economic management. At the end of the quote. Also, David Held confirms that developing countries that have benefited the most from globalization are, now I quote, those that have not played by the rules of the standard liberal market approach, including China, India, and Vietnam. In addition, those that have, for example, the Latin American and the Caribbean countries have done worse judged by the standards of East Asia and their own past. In other words, the link between growth, economic openness, and liberalization is weaker than the standard liberal argument suggests. The end of the quote. In other words, Held proves that the link between growth, economic openness, and liberalization is much weaker than liberal economists claim. As he explains, China's success has deepened significantly on a host of factors, not all of which would fit neatly into the neoliberal argument. For example, China has staggered and regulated its entry into the global markets. Tariffs have been cut, but only after economic takeoff, particularly heavily in the last 10 to 12 years. Capital movements have remained tightly regulated. Foreign direct investment is locked into partnerships, often with significant political controls. And crucially, its currency to date remains non-convertible. The end of the quote. As has been already pointed out, many Latin American countries that have fully devoted themselves to the neoliberal model offer the opposite story. William Robinson describes the impact of globalization on countries such as Ecuador, Colombia, Argentina, and Chile, which in accordance with David Ricardo's classical theory of comparative advantages, focused on producing one commodity for the world markets, like flowers, wine, soya in Argentina, and so on, and become fully dependent on fluctuations of globalization. Profits are growing above all to transnational trade companies, while their local suppliers and subcontractors bear all the risks associated with the market volatility. An extreme example are the Central American countries supplying winter fruits and vegetables to the world market. Robinson describes the inhumane practices of the transnational companies and their subcontractors, drastic conditions in maquiladoras, sweatshops, the vulnerability of local producers. Charles Dickens's social critical novels from the 19th centuries are only a poor imitation of the fact where neoliberal globalization has impelled the Latin America countries and their inhabitants. This is the fate of the periphery states that have fully accepted the neoliberal model. They are economically vulnerable, dependent and stagnant, socially devastated, politically corrupted, drowned in a gang crime and street violence. Globalization is a stormy sea for them, and every wave can sweep them away at any time. They cannot defend themselves. These all are the reasons why Dani Rodrik advocates a thin version of globalization in the Bretton Woods way, because it demonstrably works the best. The main idea can be expressed metaphorically. Let the windows open, but do not forget the mosquito screen. Exactly as during the Bretton Woods regime, it established a thin form of international economic integration with controls on international capital flows, partial trade liberalization, and many exceptions for socially sensitive sectors like agriculture, textile, or services, as well as with a few exceptions for developing countries. And it worked. Therefore, according to Rodrik, we really need an update of the Bretton Woods Compromise for the 21st century. As he said, we need smart globalization, non-maximum globalization. Rodrik is trying to prove that the national protectionism does not have to be automatically condemned and in any case harmful. The neoliberal doctrine rejects any protectionism for purely ideological reasons, and resistance to protectionism has succeeded in transposing it in a basic economic textbooks and doctrines. Hence, it is repeated by all those economic students who have preferred memorization to creativity. I hope that this is not the case of MGIMO. But if we throw away totalizing ideologies, for example, neoliberalism, and focus on practical economic policy, we find that protectionist measures have historically helped many states. He writes, Dani Rodrigue, that it would be easy to associate free trade always with economic and political progress and protectionism with backwardness and decline. It would also be misleading. It depends heavily on the context. One of the pillars of the Bretton Woods was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, so-called GATT, the predecessor of the WTO, which was designed to enable each state to pursue its social and economic goals in economic and trade policy without more serious external constraints. The rules of international cooperations in the economic field have been set more freely and flexibly. If the domestic, political or social goals are commercial global interests were at stake, the trade had to retreat. John Ruggie, the preeminent analyst of the Bretton Woods era, has called this mechanism embedded liberalism. The goal of GATT has never been to maximize free trade. It was to achieve the maximum possible extent of free trade, but it had to be compatible with the policies of the different states, their sovereignty and democratic demands of their populations. Perhaps the most important engine of the Bretton Woods system was the consensus on capital controls. Nowadays, these checks are considered by the neoliberal economists to be a resurgence that cannot be resurrected, and it would be like returning to the economic Middle Ages. This only complements the typical way neoliberalism dehistorises reality. Neoliberals' current extreme market model interpret as the embodiment of economic nature, which is the product of pure rationalism. All decisions leading to the adoption of the neoliberal model, however, have their historical power and political connections, without which the neoliberal counter-revolution would never happen. To pretend that neoliberalism is not product of history, but the embodiment of some abstract economic rationality, to pretend it has no donors who support him, to pretend it does not fit especially the richest men who have succeeded in the political struggle in a particular historical context, that is an approach that can be easily dealt with the propaganda leaflets, but in rational and historical analysis it has no space. That is why it makes sense to look at how the political decisions that led to the disappearance of capital controls and the disappearance of one of the pillars of the Bretton Woods system arose. The principal architect of the Bretton Woods regime, with his emphasis on capital control, was John Maynard Keynes. The Bretton Woods Agreement gave every government an explicit right to control all capital flow on a durable basis. What used to be heresy, said Keynes, is now endorsed as orthodoxy. The starting point was the Keynes identified unrestricted capital mobility as the fundamental problem of the global market, which ultimately led to instability, crisis, and wars, like today. Unrestrained capital flows undermined not only financial stability but also macroeconomic balances and thus full employment and price stability. As Eric Helliner adds, I quote, "The Bretton Woods architects had explicitly sought to prevent global financial markets from reassuming the dominant role they had held in the global political economy in the decades before 1931 international financial collapse." The end of the quote. Capital controls were needed to avoid speculative international financial transfers that could disrupt the political autonomy of the new Keynesian model of the welfare states. This was the reason why most of the developed countries in Europe maintained capital controls until the 80s. Also in developing countries, capital controls were a typical part of the economic policy of states, with the exceptions to this trend being rather rare. Common enthusiasm for capital controls was the product of structural breakthrough in economic thinking that followed the Great Depression in the 30s. Both private and central bankers who tended to free market economy were discredited by the crisis, and instead financial and economic decisions have been made by professional economists and government managers who have had social anchorages other than bankers, financials, or tycoons, instead of the interest of great corporations. banks and financial centers, the interest of workers, trade unions, state-owned enterprises or small and medium-sized enterprises in the domestic economy were at the forefront. Economic liberal orthodoxy was put outside the mainstream for several decades. Keynes, social democracy, the welfare state, and economic interventionism were fashionable. The big business was re-entering the world in the 70s, when the golden era of the welfare state, Keynesian economic regulation, and the Bretton Woods regime of international trade ended. As Eric Hobsbawm, famous British historian, writes, who grew up during the crisis in the 30s, and I quote, "Those of us who lived through the years of the great slump, great crisis, still find it almost impossible to understand how the orthodoxies of the poor free market, then so obviously discredited, once again came to preside over a global period of depression in the late 80s and 90s, which once again they were equally unable to understand or to deal with." The end of the quotation. The post-war Bretton Woods model began to disintegrate in the 70s, especially the first pillars of this model, the capital controls. It was no economic necessity, but a real politics that resulted in the historical decision of the great powers. They watched their national economic interest. The United States and the United Kingdom have been major financial centers and benefited from global financial liberalization. The main actors of this paradigmatic change were the financial institutions from the Wall Street and the City of London. If neoliberal globalization has its centers, then it is New York and London since the beginning. In my book, I'm trying to explain all this historical process. It started really in the United States, then it continued in the City of London lobby, and it was finished in France during the Mitterrand's presidency. Maybe you remember from the textbooks, it was in 80s. And François Mitterrand was the socialist president. That's why it was very, very shocking for the socialist camp and socialists in the world. In the first 2.5 years of François Mitterrand's presidency, he was trying to push the Keynesian and very regulatory interventions to French economy. He tried to push the capital controls. He tried to push the so-called socialism in one country, but Western socialism. But after 2.5 years, the pushes from the international capital was so strong that he had to change his policy radically, and there was a big turn to the neoliberal policies. It was in 1983. And maybe you remember the man who was the main neoliberal in his government, the Ministry of Finance. Then he was the creator of the Maastricht Treaty. It was Jacques Delors. With this name, Jacques Delors, the French so-called socialist, the neoliberal changing of the European Union started, and it continued till today. Everything is history. Nothing is done. Nothing is done, and that's it. This is the main argument in my book. You need to understand the historical decisions not as they are natural, but as political ones. Well, to come back to final sentences on Danny Roderick's theory, because I don't want to speak too much and maybe to give you some space for questions. Probably also for some political questions, if there are some, because I'm also a politician, but I hope that also some intellectual questions. Well, as regards Danny Roderick's second application he offered, it is the Tobin's tax. Probably you heard about this. It's a tax on financial transactions. Return to capital controls is not the only proposal of the back to the Bretton Woods school. The theoreticians of this school become accustomed to talk about the so-called Tobin's tax. This is a demand formulated in 1978 by James Tobin, a Keynesian economist from Yale, and later Nobel laureate for economy. Tobin pointed to the main problem of excessive mobility of private financial capital. His argument was essentially the same as the Keynes one. Capital mobility impedes the performance of monetary and fiscal policies that would be different from other economies, undermining thus the sovereign economic policy of the states. Tobin argued that the world economy can take only one of two ways. A single world currency could be adopted and the global economy regulated as it is regulated on the domestic market. This would eliminate all the difficulties and deformations created by the differences of national currencies. Although the price we would pay for it would be that all states would have to submit to a single monetary policy. Tobin considered this scenario to be politically unrealistic, and he therefore presented the alternative solution. As he stated in his famous argumentation, what we need is to throw some sand in the wheels of our excessively efficient international money markets. His specific recommendations was a tax on international currency transaction, a Tobin tax, as it has come to be called. Later, many modern countries have actually adopted different taxes concerning the financial transactions, and as we have already mentioned, even after the European financial crisis, even the European Union has attempted to accept such tax, though without much success. Most Keynesian and other left-wing economists, however, advocate this tax as one way to weaken unrestricted mobility of capital and financial flows. Talking about the European Union, this proposal of financial transaction tax is one of the saddest stories of European integration, when some countries wanted to present this idea, but it was very easily limited and blocked by other countries which were more liberal or more neoliberal. And this is sometimes the fate of all the more progressive economic policies in the European Union, that usually there can be very easily vetoed by other countries. And this is maybe the main problem of all the progressive proposals of the Bretton Woods School. Well, Dani Rodrigues concludes his argument, and this is very important because probably you will even need this information about Dani Rodrigues when you want to pass your exams. Probably you will have this author in your lectures later. Dani Rodrigues concludes his argument with the famous Globalization Trilemma. As he writes, among the three important processes or values, hyperglobalization, democracy, and national sovereignty, we can keep maximally two of them. We can never have all of three at one time. So you have to choose between democracy, national sovereignty, and hyperglobalization, two of them. If we choose hyperglobalization and national sovereignty, imagine, we will take the path of such countries as Pinochet Chile. Maybe you remember from the history the fascist regime or authoritarian regime of Pinochet, but with very neoliberal economic policies. In the name of a neoliberal policy that sacrifices all social goals in favor of adapting to the demands of the global economy, the state sacrifices democracy. It must ignore people's needs because it is governed by the requirements of global markets. Democracy is replaced by an openly fascist or authoritarian regime, or it is at best overshadowed, and the elected elites merely pretend to fulfill the mandate they have won in the democratic elections. This is usual in the European countries. Where there is no alternative, democracy is out of the question. Alternatives do not exist only in totalitarianism. The second option is that we choose hyperglobalization and democracy. In that case, however, we must sacrifice national sovereignty. An example is the European integration process. Democracy, in a symbolic, abridged form, shifts to transnational technocratic elites who have a direct or indirect mandate to adapt the globalization pressure. We can see it in the European elections, where maybe some 20% people are turning up, but there is no real democratic discourse, no real democracy in these elections. National sovereignty, however, must be suppressed, because transnational institutions cannot accept national interest and the different goals of different states if they are to accept the demands of global markets. First, small, weak, and above all indebted states are losing their sovereignty, like it was with Greece during the debt crisis. But gradually, even the larger, richer, and the more powerful countries will be tamed by markets with the help of transnational technocrats. Rodrigues recommends third option. to sacrifice hyper-globalization, to deglobalize. It is the only way to save both democracy and national sovereignty. The Bretton Woods system combined these two values with a moderate form of globalization, and exactly the same is recommended by Rodrik, who talks about the Bretton Woods Compromise. International trade rules were so loose that states could follow different paths of their development. In hyper-globalization, nothing like this is possible. Everyone has to adapt to neoliberal demands, otherwise market punish them, as ancient deities or gods or tribunals of inquisition punished impudent heretics in the past. Rodrik, however, considers deglobalization a realistic alternative. Finally, many East Asian states have built their economic miracle on industrial policies that have been banned by the World Trade Organization in the meantime. By the late 70s, many countries of Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa had managed to maintain unprecedented economic growth through export support, which isolated their economies from the world economy. All this allowed the Bretton Woods Compromise, which was broken by the liberalization of capital flows, not to speak that the trade agreements began to exceed national borders and became imperatives that bound national democratic policies. Well, now probably I will finish with some concluding remarks as regards Danny Rodrik's ideas. He don't propose any revolution. He just proposed that we should deglobalize in such a manner that the International Monetary Fund, WTO, or the other transnational institutions should not devastate national sovereignty and national democracy. And this is the main argument. If we want to follow the globalization issues or to follow the free trade, we need to give to national states also the opportunity to help to improve their domestic industries, also to have the opportunity to redistribute the wealth, to have more political stability, and the opportunity to limit the capital controls which can be damaging on their economies. And this is the main idea of Danny Rodrik, of Erich Helleiner, and many others, rather social democratic or social liberal economists and Keynesian economists. These last sentences are not very connected to Marxism I was talking about before. Marxists, they want a revolutionary solution. It means that instead of this liberal economy, it should be much more concentration of internationalist, socialist cooperation of different nation states. But this is the question for future, and probably here in your country and in my country as well, everybody knows that the revolution will not come next Tuesday, so we need to speak about the reformist solution. So this is my first lecture for you, and then there is a Q&A time, so if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer it. Thank you. So first question is, yeah?
So, student of the first grade international economic relations, Alex. My question is that how do you see the possibility of imposing the Tobin tax in the EU region? So because you said like this very important, like.
Yeah. You know, it was a very funny story because, well, you maybe remember that there was the Greek debt crisis in the European Union. Everybody was talking like we must reform the European finance and fiscal politics, and we need to adopt the FTT, this financial transaction tax, and so on. But like time went up, suddenly the crisis was coming down, the economy was growing, and suddenly all the technocrats were stopped to speak about this, including this FTT. Suddenly, again, we had the same neoliberal measures like before. You remember that the crisis was the consequence of these neoliberal policies. There was no regulation, there was the liberalization, there was no state intervention, and suddenly this, chaos should came. But you know, after the crisis, there was big state involvement in the economy because economy should have been recovered. But after this state recovery, again we became with these neoliberal measures like before, like nothing happened. And probably, and this is the paradox, probably the next crisis will come in a few years. And we are going not to be prepared as well. And that's why the economy of European Union is by some authors and critics dominated by big corporations and big banks. And that's why we are not trying to make more restrictions on capital and more regulation. And this is a big, big historical fault and big mistake. FTT, this Tobin tax, is one of the examples. It was, I think, 11 states, member states of European Union, which tried to make so-called enhanced cooperation. According to the Lisbon Treaty, there is a possibility of enhanced cooperation. It means that not every member state should agree on some such measures, like Tobin tax, but if it's some part of them, 11, it's possible. It's still possible for them to make such measures. Slovakia, fortunately, was one of these 11 states, so I am quite free to say it, but also including France, Germany, and all the strongest state. The biggest critics were the liberal, very open economies from Scandinavia, Great Britain, of course, like every time, and some others. But the reason was very pragmatic, sometimes not ideological, that okay, if we make this transnational, this transactional tax, this Tobin tax on financial capital, and other countries like America and others will not do that, they will have the advantage to compete with our financial markets, because we are going to be very restrictive and they are not going to be restrictive. Well, this argument is quite fantasy, because you have the domestic financial transaction tax in many countries till now. There are the FTT in France, FTT in Brazil, FTT in many other countries, and it's not damaging their financial markets. So this is not the main argument. But it was very popular because, especially of the experience of Sweden in 90s, because Sweden in 80s tried to propose this Tobin tax, and it was not very successful. Especially they have the crisis in 90s, but there were many historical and specificities of Sweden which couldn't have to be repeated. So this FTT on the European level could be done, but the political will was not there, because we came back to this neoliberal arrangement, and this is very bad, I think, for the future. So in the future, probably the next crisis will come. The speculation is back on the table. The casino capitalism, as it is called, labeled in the scientific literature, is still there, and we are just waiting that there will be new drama and the new slump and the new crisis. And imagine now political consequences. You can see in the European Union, I don't know how it is in your country, the rise of this, how to say it, really dissatisfaction of people. Like many people vote for far-right parties in the European Union, many people vote for far-left parties in the European Union. Many people vote for some alternative. They don't want this kind of establishment, this kind of capitalism, or this kind of whatever. They want some change. And this became in the European Union in the times of the record economic growth. In Slovakia, we have 4% of GDP of growth. We have just 5% of unemployment. The same for many other countries, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. The same for France and Germany. It's a beautiful boom, economic boom. And in this period, the people are so unsatisfied that you can see in Paris, the yellow vests are going and, ruining the shops. And in Germany, the AfD, the far-right party, has 15% of support. And in Italy, the rather populist government is there between where the far-right populist from Salvini's party and the far-left populist from the Movimento 5 Star. Everywhere there is a political mess. In this economic boom, imagine what will come when there will be an economic crisis. It will be much harder. And this economic crisis will come in few years. It's always like this, from economy, it's cycles. It was the crisis in 2008, so it will be a crisis in few years. I think it should have been here. So very probably, it will be a big political mess. And I wrote this book, and I'm trying to organize some mobilization, especially to be prepared for such a mess, because then you will need to offer some alternative, and if this alternative will be not offered by the left-wing anti-globalist, it will be offered by the neo-Nazis, because they're starting to be very popular in European Union. So that's why if the left is not going to be much more concentrated on the new alternative, on the new sovereign alternative, it can be very dangerous for the future of the Europe. And I hope that the FTT, Tobin's text, will be included in this alternative. But thank you very much for your question. Is there any other one?
Yes, so I have another one.
Yeah, great.
Concerning the World Trade Organization and its neoliberal policy about like free trade and so on. So do you think, and in which way it should be or should not be reformatted and so on?
I would say that when I'm trying to synthesize all these anti and alter-globalist thinkers and their proposals, usually it was three proposals. You know that there is so-called holy trinity of the world trade liberalism. It's the WTO, is the IMF, and is the WB. So World Bank, World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund. One sort of the anti and alter-globalists say, let's cancel World Bank. The second sort, let's cancel IMF. And the third, let's cancel WTO. And I think the third is the most popular. So let's cancel it. Walden Bello, Samir Amin, and Dani Rodriguez not so radical. He say, okay, let's very much limit its power. But this is the front of the critics. Then you have the front of the radical neoliberals who are unsatisfied with the WTO because it's too moderate for them. So on the opposite way. So they say, okay, so it's so limiting because there were many rounds of negotiations and they were like upset that it can be more and more liberal. So they started to have these bilateral or multilateral trade negotiations and trade deals. One of the examples is TTIP, or maybe you know it, Transnational Trade and Investments Partnership between the European Union and America, and the United States of America, which was negotiated during the last years. After Donald Trump became the president of the USA, it just was frozen. But still it's on the table, and everybody from the neoliberal centers hope that Trump will be away and then TTIP is back in the game. The same case is CETA. CETA is the deal with Canada and the European Union. And all these bilateral deals are trying to replace the WTO, because WTO is a very neoliberal, but still not neoliberal enough for many capital corporations. So this is the situation. When you read, and you are the economist, so you will probably read all the textbooks, all the leading literature of globalization and political economy, you will see that all the economists will say the same. This globalization is really bad. It's really bad, and these consequences on environment, on social inequality, on economic instability, and so on. So it needs to be changed. This is the, I think, 9 from 10 economists of the world. But when you came to the reality, the 9 from the 10 typical political analysts and political economic analysts you can see in the newspapers will say, oh, this is great, everything is great, no, don't change anything. And if, let's change it more liberal. So this is a big discrepancy between the academy and between the politics. And the reason is that academy is free and the politics is still very much influenced by big money. And this is the answer for your question. Yes, I think that WTO should be reformed, or maybe even cancelled and replaced by something better. But there is no political realism in this for now. After the crisis, it changed. I'm looking forward.
Okay,
thank you.
I have one question. It's not actually very linked to your speech, but you were talking about deglobalization, and I was wondering, I know that in the past 2 years, 1 year, I know that there has been a very big problem in Europe. It's been all over the world. Crimes with cryptocurrency and crimes with bitcoins. you're talking about deglobalization, but if we do have this deglobalization, how is the European Union supposed to unite against these sort of crimes?
Well, deglobalization doesn't mean, I will be very general because I'm not really expert on bitcoins. Everybody is trying to explain it to me, but I am deaf and dumb as regards to these bitcoins. But in general, deglobalization doesn't mean that you are going to have the North Koreas of the world and everybody is isolated and not going even to the different country. No, it's not like this. This is typical that when you say that you are anti-globalist, what do you imagine? Probably some anarchists are like crashing the Molotov cocktails on the McDonald's, or you can imagine that somebody who is deeply nationalistic, who doesn't want to travel and don't use the internet. This is not anti-globalist. Anti-globalism, maybe in some liberal medias, yes, but anti-globalism means that you are for deglobalization, that you don't like this neoliberal model of globalization with its environmental consequences, social consequences, economic consequences, its lack of the political democracy and sovereignty. This is the problem of anti-globalist. And when they are talking about the alternatives, they always talk about international cooperation. They want to have kind of united Europe, for example, or united Southeast Asia, or united Latin America. There are such proposals, but they don't want to have it on such terms like it is today. So they don't want to have neoliberal European Union. They want to have some intergovernmental cooperation between the European states, which will have some sovereignty, which will have some social states arrangements and so on. So the problem is this, the same for the Southeast Asia. ASEAN is neoliberal. They want to replace ASEAN, but not replace with the states, which will be like, bastions. They want to replace it by some more progressive forms of cooperation between the states. So this is maybe the answer for your question. Yes, we need to be together, like facing terrorism, facing maybe this type of questions, facing environmental problems and so on, of course. But today it is like this. You are in Brussels, you are a technocrat, you probably have good money from these corporations and banks, and you are trying to push all the countries and all the peoples to one way, one ideology, liberalism. Everything other is cancelled. And if you say that there is somebody who wants some alternative, he must be Russian agent or some hybrid war or something. So this is the type of European discourse today. And everything which is different than its neoliberal model must be Chinese, Russian, or communist conspiracy. And I don't eat this. I just want to have the alternative on this. And that doesn't mean that I'm the nationalist or that I am something like this. Thank you. If you have any questions also about politics, no problem. I'm also here as a chairman of the European Affairs Committee on Slovak Parliament. So if you have questions on European and Slovakian politics.
About the Bretton Woods system, as I see, the most important error, the mistake that they made is that they declined the idea of case of imposing a united currency for every country, for all of the world. So, why do you think Bretton Woods system screwed up?
Well, there are many theories about this. Usually they are very historical. One of them is connected to this American history. America was a very indebted country because of the Vietnam War. It was a very expensive war. And during the time, the Americans had to lend the money from the financial market, and they need some liberalized way how to do it. So this was the historical reason for Nixon, who made this stuff, and he was the man who eliminated the Keynesian model, the Bretton Woods model. You remember that his decision. So this was one historical case. The second was the City of London and the New York financial market was the main proponents of this change because it was in their interest, and they were still more powerful in the European and American politics. Then you have very interesting thing, change of the mood. After the Second World War, this generation was really frustrated from the war. Maybe you probably don't know, maybe you read it in the historical papers, but in the 30s, there was a devastating economic crisis, which meant huge unemployment, huge inequality. Really, the people were dying in the streets. Imagine that you have the family, you have the kids, and the kids had nothing to eat. This was the situation in the 30s. Then was the rise of the Nazism and extremism. And whole generation after the Second World War was afraid that if there will be the liberalized market like it was in the 30s, then will be the crisis, then will be the fascism. So it was like a sacrosanct that, oh, no fascism, so no liberalism. So they started to blame liberalism on fascism. And that's why they didn't want to have this liberal free trade. That's why they started to be Keynesian. Welfare states, social redistribution, capital controls, and all of this stuff of Keynes. But this generation died. This generation was faded away, and in the 60s and 70s, the new generation came. And you remember in the European Union, it was the generation of the new left and the new right. New left was talking not about the social injustice, but about the gays, minorities, environment. So about the new left, postmodern issues. Because in Western states, there was so much welfare programs that as a young man, you have the education, you had the healthcare, you had the good living standards. So what's your problem? Gays, minorities, and so on. So really, if you have solved your social problems, you will start to explain your comrades that the minority problems are the most important. It's very natural. And then new right came with the argument that okay, Keynesian model is going to be in crisis. This was a real crisis. There was the so-called deflation, depression and inflation in the same period. So they have the good arguments that something is going bad. But their alternative was even worse, I would say. So new right came with the argument that, okay, let's liberalize, let's deregulate, let's privatize. This is the typical neoliberal arguments of the new right. And it started with Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s. And now we are here. We are still in the Thatcherist and Reaganist economics of free trade and lack of welfare states and so on. But it didn't come like from nothing. In 60s and 70s, the mental world of the people were still socialist in many sense. Like, oh, we don't want this liberalism because of fascism. But at the time, the corporations and banks were very upset, frustrated. You can imagine, you live in the socialist world, I mean, like Sweden or in Germany, it was really socialist, redistribution. I don't mean socialist like communist, like it was in my country and your country. I mean the Western socialist. And they were upset and frustrated, like, oh, okay, we have to pay so much taxes, and we are so much regulated, and so it's so bad for our profits. Societies were okay, but banks and corporations were not okay with this. So they started to fund the NGOs, very much think tank and NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And you can remember from the history of economy, the Chicago boys from Chicago. It was the monetary school of this Milton Friedman. Or you can imagine how there was the return of these Hayek's ideas. Hayek was like Friedrich von Hayek. He was the philosopher and economist who was like a clown for the generation after the Second World War, because he was telling about the free market. Everybody, didn't you mention this fascism from it? So Hayek was like a clown, but suddenly he was the popular hero of the new right. Suddenly, today, maybe yes, even today, he's like, oh, he's the right guy, the Hayek, Friedman. In the 60s and 70s, they were like, oh, exotic. So this was the change. The corporations and banks were funded. They have many money. They funded all these NGOs, all these newspapers. Let's look on The Economist. Maybe you read it. This is the typical magazine of City of London. They don't even pretend some objectivity. It's just neoliberal magazine of City of London, and bankers are reading it. And this is the truth of the bankers. But it's very influential. Everybody, if you are a politician in Austria, you will read The Economist. I don't think that this is the main problem, because The Economist is the same from the 19th century. Even Herbert Spencer wrote for Economist his social Darwinist ideas, and they are the same. The difference is on the left side. What is the opposite of The Economist? The Guardian. But the Guardian is now writing the same shit as the Economist, the same neoliberal shit, but also more concentration on again, gays and women and all these environmental issues, but in the economic terms, the same shit. So this is the crisis of today's world. There is no alternative. Everybody became neoliberal. This is the main thesis of David Harvey. Maybe you know this philosopher. He said, everybody became neoliberal today. Even when we are trying to say that we want to be more social, we are using the neoliberal arguments. That, okay, we people are individuals and we need to more rights. We are not talking about communities. We are not talking about the solidarity. We are not talking that we are the members of society, of families, of tribes, of something. No, we are all is individual and has its rights. He is homo economicus, has its profits. And then this is the presumption, typical liberal. Communitarian presumption is, okay, we are the members of societies and we need to have some duties, not only the rights. And this is something which is absolutely alien to this liberal ideology. And this liberal ideology is one of the main pillars of global capitalism. Without it, it would be cruised, it would be destroyed. So this is very philosophical, and I don't want to be too much philosophical because you are economists and probably philosophy is really boring for you. So just to say that today we live really in neoliberal times, and I'm sure that it will sooner or later become a crisis. And this crisis can be very, very damaging, like it was in history in the 30s with fascism, and even later in 2008 with some crushing in the European Union and others. Russia has its experience with the crisis as well. So I'm not happy with this, but this is the capitalist economy cycling, like one up and down, and we are coming from this way there. So I wouldn't make many future plans to be with you. Well, oh, we need to go. Oh, it was really great to speak with you, especially to you too. Thank you.